Hey everyone, what is going on? What is going on? My name is Curtis Brooks. I am a men's life coach. I help men communicate their way to healthy relationships. Guys, this is a late broadcast. I had actually intended on going live on LinkedIn as well. So for now, I'm just actually going live to YouTube. Uh, the people on LinkedIn, I'm thinking they're probably asleep by now. But in any event, I want to talk to you about how men can overcome anger. That's what we're talking about tonight. That will be our discussion. I did a live on LinkedIn, so you can check me out over on LinkedIn at live coaching, the number 4.men. Couldn't get life coaching for men as I am here on YouTube. Again, live coaching for the number 4.men. Again, live coaching, the number 4.men. Over on Instagram, you can find me out there. So this is a Q&A Thursday. I've kind of entitled this Q&A Thursday moving forward as well. So I'm glad you're here. Thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you'll watch the replay as well. And if you have any questions, guys, you can absolutely ask away, and I will try and answer those questions as quick as possible. And or if you're watching replays, you can leave a comment in the comment section of this broadcast. So, and guys, we're talking about how men can overcome anger. Let's first talk about the contributors to anger. And there are absolutely many. There are many contributors to anger. And the first being, as I mentioned earlier, I did a broadcast on IG, same title, same discussion essentially. Just wanted to bring it here over to YouTube as I promised. But yeah, the first one is going to be lack of experience. That is always going to be a contributor to anger and how men are dealing with anger or their lack thereof, and mainly because uh, as men are dealing with anger again because of lack of experience, it means that they're often reaching a plateau. They're often reaching a plateau, and as I mentioned earlier in an IG podcast, is that one of the biggest things is because of lack of experience. For instance, like you were taking, or if an individual, a man has been and is accustomed to being in relationships, 3 to 5 months, 6 month relationships. That's it works for some people, but there's a reason why he is in those relationships, in most cases short term, because oftentimes those relationships reach a plateau. And in reaching that plateau, it's typically having to do with lack of experience and uh, wanting those or desiring for those relationships to go further. And even if the individual, the man, is desiring for those relationships to go further, that just means that again he must do something different. And 9 times out of 10, he is not doing anything different than he has already done, that he hasn't already done. So he's dealing with lack of information again, all just kind of coming down to lack of experience. So number two, the men have a challenge with saying I'm sorry. Men have a challenge oftentimes, again, having to deal with anger. We're talking about the contributors to anger. And oftentimes those contributors to anger are, one, as I mentioned, lack of experience. Number two, this is what we're talking about. Number two, we're talking about the lack of acceptance, not being able to apologize. That's one of the biggest challenges that with men not being able to apologize. It's not to say that women don't have those challenges too. It's not to say that, but we are talking about men. I predominantly coach men, so that's my space or area of expertise is working with men. So we're not passing the buck and say, oh, women do it too. Yes, they do, but we're talking about men and helping men get themselves together, So that's the point of this discussion here. Again, helping men get themselves together so that we can overcome that anger, and that anger will not be in the way, or at least we'll overcome those challenges that we often deal with anger being in the way and preventing us from having healthy, long-term and healthy relationships. So again, number two, for men, again, one of the contributors, not being able to accept, or our unwillingness to accept blame or accept fault for something that we may have done. Okay, not talking about accepting fault for what someone else has done, but accepting fault for the role that we played, our part in whatever it may be. So, again, um, uh, failure to accept responsibility and the role that we played and whatever it may be. Failure in communication. That's actually, in fact, it's number three. Lack of communication. Lack of communication comes from, it can come from a lot of different places, but I'll even go and we'll talk more about this as well. Lack of education. Lack of education. So that kind of plays into number three, uh, lack of communication, meaning that oftentimes with our lack of communication, it comes from a space of just not knowing. And is it our fault because we don't know? Uh, it's not a matter of, again, it's not a matter of having to play the blame game, but it is that oftentimes when we're entering relationships, we've got to we got to in some regards have done the work. But the challenge is a lot of times we haven't done the work. And because we haven't done the work, it makes it super difficult for us to um, uh, get to a place where we're communicating effectively. So the lack of communication is no longer an issue. But again, because we have not done the work, it makes it very difficult for us to get beyond uh, those issues that people have because they don't have the experience, or again, they don't have the education. And education meaning that knowing thyself, and that's kind of what I want to segue into, is that the education piece of it is not so much in regards to having a associate's degree or being well versed on some other technology. No, what I mean in this respect or regards is knowing thyself. That's a huge piece. And knowing how we deal with certain things and having had placed ourselves or at least been in certain situations. And I understand that education or educating ourselves or knowing ourselves, I should say, it doesn't come overnight, guys. It does not come overnight. It is one of those things where you build upon. One of those things that we the lessons that we learn in life along the way. So it's not something that's going to happen overnight. So, but when you've come to a certain age in life, I'll put it this way: when you've come to a certain age in life, it's necessary to have gone through certain education, if you will, again, educating ourselves about knowing who we are as men. And the challenge, because we don't have an idea of who we are as men. And I would, let me step out here. It's not so much about not knowing who we are as men, but how we deal with things and adverse situations. What walls have we built up? And regard to knowing who we are, knowing myself, knowing yourself in regards to that. When you are placed in a situation, how are you going to behave? What is your communication like? Does your communication become abusive because you feel that you're in some kind of bind or some kind of crunch, or someone has said something to you that has triggered a particular emotion or from something that you haven't dealt with? So this is what I mean by education. That is a huge component. And oftentimes men don't have the education, or they have not educated themselves about thyself. And if they have not educated themselves about thyself, it absolutely makes it very difficult to know how you and I are going to respond when life gives us those adverse situations. And it absolutely will. It's just a matter of time. It is life, gentlemen. It is life. So, again, we're talking about how can men overcome anger? How can men overcome anger? This is a Q&A, so if you have any questions, if you're watching, ask away, and I will definitely get to your questions. Uh, Let me know if you have any questions. I'm here to answer any questions you might have. Again, we're not just talking about anger, but we're talking about uh, communication as a whole. We're talking about relationships. We're talking about finances and things that all these things that contribute to the contribute to healthy relationships or the demise of relationships? What can we do to repair that breach? So that's what we're talking about, guys. So again, going beyond just how can men overcome anger, essentially leaving the door open. Any questions that you might have, ask away. So, as I mentioned, number one, experience or lack thereof experience. How can we as men overcome anger? Is that we need to get more experience, and it can make it difficult to get more experience, especially when the saying is "Be careful touching the stove, and you burn your hand." And it's less often that we want to try and attempt that thing again. And obviously, I'm not talking about touching stoves, but I'm just kind of using this as an example, where it's that if you touch the stove and you burnt yourself, there's a less likely of a chance that we're going to try and attempt it again. Or first, we're going to make sure it's off, before we touch it. But there's even a less likely of a chance that we'll even go back. Maybe the stove is off. Maybe there should have been things that we should have looked into before touching the stove. But as it stands in life, a lot of times we're reluctant to go back. And this is relationships sometimes. This is relationships. A lot of times this is what happens in relationships, is that we dealt with a particular experience. It left a burn or a scar or something that we would remember, and we seldom go back to it. We seldom go back to that thing and try to rectify it and look deeper into it. And maybe it was just us having a bad day. Maybe it was the other individual having a bad day. But again, as human beings, once we feel like we've been burnt the first time, we seldom go back. And if and when we do go back, excuse me, if and when we do go back, we can absolutely find ourselves going back with a different attitude. Not necessarily that our behavior has changed, but coming back, or at least approaching this thing, or trying to give a second chance to a new relationship again, or a third chance, whatever the case might be, trying to give a second or third chance or another opportunity to a relationship. And we can find ourselves again trying to mask that thing, but with a different attitude. Not that the behavior has changed, but we can find ourselves trying to mask it with a different attitude. Perhaps maybe coming in more hopeful, but with the same, but in most cases with the same situation, or at least the same parameters or rules, or the fence that we've got up, that same fence that's been there, it hasn't been taken down. We're almost kind of like, as people, we're almost kind of like, okay, I'm just gonna wait and see what happens. So we're not necessarily participating, and that can be, yeah, it's just very interesting, because sometimes it can be that we're not participating in a relationship because we've been burnt, but we want a new relationship, but we've been burnt. So we're kind of standing back, but yet we're not standing back. But the reason why we're in this place is because there's that fence, or that imaginary line that we've drawn, if you will. And again, and symbolizing that something that we've done, or that was done to us, we've been burnt, or we have burnt others. And we're not going to talk about that, but in this particular certain area, we're talking about how we're dealing with the pain. And because we've dealt with the pain before, we can be in a relationship and not necessarily participating, but being in a relationship and just kind of sitting back, waiting to see what happens, because we've seen it before, we've been burnt before, and I'm not going to give this person permission to burn me, or at least touch that stove again and get burned again. So, I mean, there's a lot to this, guys. Again, lack of experience. Experience tells us, for those who are deciding to do this adult thing in life, experience tells us, guess what? This is all part of life, gentlemen. This is all part of life. And because it is part of life, it's something that we've got to learn how to deal with and overcome, understand, not deal with it in the sense where we're pushing it up, sweeping it under the rug. And what happens so often with us as men, or just people as a whole, we end up trying to sweep it under the rug. And it ends up showing up in another relationship. Well, wait a minute. I got rid of that. I got rid of that in a previous relationship. We start yet another relationship, and those things or tendencies, behaviors happen to show up yet in a brand new relationship. It's called lack of experience. That's what it's called, gentlemen, lack of experience. And as I mentioned earlier, that lack of experience can absolutely have us coming to, or at least reaching a pinnacle in all of our relationships, or many relationships, and reaching that peak, if you will, and going and trying to get past that thing. But because of our issue or the challenges or the contributors to our anger, whatever we may be dealing with, it's like a tug of war. It's like a tug. It wants to go, but our anger, or that contributing factor to our anger, can be so ingrained in us that our relationships have a tendency to take a downward or a decline, if you will, going back the other way, a recess, if you will. So, unfortunately, again, lack of experience and knowing how to deal with those things and put them in their proper perspective. And placing those things in their proper perspective is just what we do as adults. I talked about in the earlier broadcast on LinkedIn, on IG, is that oftentimes we find activities such as yoga, working out, lifting weights, and things of that nature. Maybe it's running for you, or some other activity. Maybe it's talking on the phone, or just kind of just trying to make yourself busy. And though those things can absolutely be stress relievers, and for many people they are stress relievers, but the biggest uh, way that we can overcome this challenge that we're dealing with, especially as it relates to men's anger, is getting it off our chest, is talking about it, having a discussion, and and looking. Uh, I think it was number two that I mentioned as part of the contributing factors to anger, and that was being able to accept responsibility for the blame, or taking blame, say, hey, that's mine, and not taking accepting responsibility in a way where it becomes a personal, making it a personal issue, but accepting it for change. Because here's the reality: you cannot change anything that you're not willing to take hold of, that you're not willing to accept. If you or I are not willing to accept, hey, that's mine, that I did that, you can't change your behavior. There are not many people who are willing to change something which they're not, or at least are able to change something which they have not accepted. And I think that's the bulk of what many of us have dealt with in this world, until we, or dealt with in society, until we come to a place where we're able to accept the responsibility for the mishap, the miscommunication, something that we should have did a different way, should have said something in a different way. I should have said XYZ. I could have waited to say that in a different way. So again, oftentimes it's us as human beings just not accepting responsibility, and I believe this leads to a an issue that so many of us are dealing with, be it even our finances, accepting responsibility for this is where we're at because we didn't know how to manage our money, accepting the fact that the other person is responding to us in a certain way because we didn't know how to communicate what we were feeling. And we could have said it in maybe a zillion different ways, but what came to mind because of our own anger, because of the thing that we're dealing with or haven't dealt with, we are responding with the very first thought. So, as part of doing this adult thing in life, We're learning how to communicate. We're learning how to be patient. And what I've learned through the course of just different relationships is that oftentimes it requires being recognizing the other person's boundaries. And for me personally, that was a challenge for me because when there was an issue that had arose for me, I wanted to discuss it right then and there. I was ready to talk about it. And maybe the other person, in most cases for me, my situation or former situations, whereas the other person wasn't ready to talk about it. And it doesn't mean that the individuals, the individuals who I'm the individuals who I am communicating with, be it in a relationship, whatever the case may be, it doesn't mean that they're ready to talk about it now, but it means that I have had to accept the boundaries that they had established. Perhaps they didn't want to talk about it, and I had to be okay with that and wait for that moment. But yeah, it was a difficult thing for me to be able to garner those feelings or my own feelings or my emotions because I wanted to talk about it now. So that I had to wrangle those emotions in and be okay with accepting their boundaries. So we could even toss in that oftentimes that the the lack of accepting other people's boundaries leads to anger as well, or can lead to anger. It's important, guys. Boundaries are absolutely important. So again, we're talking about how men can overcome anger. This is a Q&A Thursday. Ask any questions that you may have. So if you're listening in, type your questions in or type your comments in. I can absolutely bring them on screen and answer them as quickly and thoroughly as possible. Or if you're watching a replay, you can absolutely watch a replay. Ask away in that space as well by leaving a comment, and I will definitely respond to any comments that you might have or any questions you may have regarding this broadcast. So we're talking about how men can overcome anger, and I've been sharing with you. Excuse me. I've been sharing with you several points or several factors that were contributors to men's anger. First one I mentioned was lack of experience. Second one I mentioned lack of or failure to accept responsibility. Excuse me. And that's not just obviously that's not just saying I'm sorry. That means that the things that we've done personally, not meaning that we may have actually maybe let's say cut in front of someone's car and oh I'm sorry I didn't mean to do that or said the wrong things. Failure to accept responsibility in different areas of life as a whole. And I should probably clarify that. But just as a whole, failure to accept responsibility and that lack of accepting responsibility can absolutely spill off into not only our personal lives, obviously that's where it comes from again, but dealing with those things or failure to deal with those things personally, it spills off into our professional lives as well. So yeah, so failure to accept responsibility, just at large, if you will. That's number two. Number three, poor communication. Poor communication, not not being able to communicate effectively. That absolutely can lend its way or contribute to anger. And number four, and guys, this is definitely not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. There are many, many contributors to men's anger or to anger to people as a whole. There's many, many different contributors, but I shared these items with you because I thought they were some of the ones that were absolutely important. And again, I mentioned lack of experience, failure to accept responsibility. Number three was number three is what is number three? Number three was poor communication. Number three, poor communication. And number four, lack of education, knowing thyself. No, we're not talking about whether you've got a degree or your doctorate or you got your master's. No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about knowing thyself. How well do we know ourselves, thyself, as men, meaning that when we are when life places us in those different situations, difficult situations, as life will, it will place us absolutely in difficult situations. Hey Shrek, what's going on, man? Thanks for joining, or what? Sure if it's a man or woman. Thanks for joining, Shrek. But yeah, life will absolutely place us in those difficult situations, man. It absolutely will. There's no getting around that. We'll definitely be placed in difficult situations. So, and knowing thyself is that how do we respond to such challenges? How do we respond to such difficulties in life as they present themselves? And they will present themselves. It's just a matter of time. It's just a matter of time. They will absolutely present themselves. So, how well do we know ourselves in those situations? And what do we say? How do we respond? So that's what the education. That's what number 4 is about: educating ourselves again, knowing thyself, so that we're not uh, continuously, or perpetually placing ourselves, or at least being or responding, I should say, responding to such situations the same way. So, question arises now: how do we overcome this anger? How do we overcome it? One, drum roll. I need some sound effects here. Drum roll. We find someone that we can talk to. One of the biggest challenges for men, and I'm sure it's challenges for women sometimes too, but we're not talking about women, we're talking about men. One of the biggest challenges for men is finding someone to talk to, or at least having the courage to talk with someone, then say, hey, I got a problem. I got a situation. I need to get this matter off my chest. I need to get this situation off my chest. And because we fail to come to a place to practice courage, if you will, to put that same courage that we will use to keep our mouths quiet, that would silence us. And I don't know if it's called courage or even pride. Perhaps it's just pride. But if we could flip that, turn that thing around, and now what was pride, we're using this courage to say, hey, you know what, Curtis, you have a moment, or to whomever, a good friend of yours, someone you can trust, someone that creates a safe space for you, a safe space and a safe place for you to be able to talk, to be able to communicate, to be able to say, hey, I've got a situation, and I it's been bothering me and I need some help. So the first one is overcoming anger, is finding a safe place and a safe space to talk with someone. Being able to admit that, hey, this same courage or this pride thing that's been keeping my mouth shut, I wanna, I want to diffuse this thing, because ultimately the anger uh, is like a ticking time bomb for a lot of us as men. I've been there as well, guys. So that anger is like a ticking time bomb, and ready to disrupt our lives at any time, such as our being able to, that ticking time bomb. Again, we're talking about anger, that anger blowing up, having us blow up at work on a issue that had nothing to do with what was even. It may not have that issue may not have been related to what was being discussed, but for whatever reason, it triggered something in us, and so now we've got a contributor to the anger that was maybe taking place when we were younger, 10 years old, 15 years old, maybe younger. But as a result, it was a contributor to the anger that has increasingly been built up in us. And now we're having a discussion at work or at home with the wife, or with a significant other, and they're speaking about something, but yet how we hear it, how we hear that item, what they're talking about, is completely different or unrelated to what they've said. And now we're flying off the handle about something completely unrelated to what they were talking about. So it's important for us to find someone that we can talk to, and then admit that, hey, I got an issue. I need help with this thing. Secondly, being able to acknowledge that that item is yours. Being able to acknowledge that this problem is mine. And here's the thing, if you, me, or anyone else, if you had multiple relationships and you can find yourself, blaming other people at different times, or and just blaming other people, it has a tendency to happen more frequently. We've got to stop and listen, guys. We can't turn a deaf ear to our stuff and yet call ourselves being available to yet someone else's stuff. It doesn't make sense. So that means that we've got to rectify what's going on with us first. And as I've stated before in a different broadcast, we have to be prepared to put our own mask on first. But the challenge is that we, as just people, it's a people thing sometimes, or a lot of times it's a people thing that we're trying to help someone else put their mask on. We're trying to get the speck out of our brother's eye, but yet we're dealing with a larger issue that we need to overcome. And in some cases, I've been there too, where it feels better. I can help someone else first. It feels better first with that. But oftentimes life gets so busy. Life gets so busy, guys, that we can find ourselves just being dedicated, if you will, and trying to help other people. And we ourselves need to help. We're still dealing with issues ourselves. So it's nice to be able to help other people. But if you haven't been helped yourself, it becomes difficult to help others in what they may be in need of help. How can we help someone if we haven't helped ourselves, or if the breach or the bridge hasn't been repaired in different aspects of our own lives? It becomes difficult to mend or help someone else repair those areas in their lives. Whether we're talking to our children, whether we're talking to our spouse or significant other, colleagues, or if you're a CEO of a company, again, it can become very difficult to tend to other people's issues if we haven't dealt with or tended our own issues, guys. So, guys, I'm going to wrap this up here. I've been on for about a half an hour, a little bit over half an hour. I want to say thank you, Shrek, for tuning in for a few moments. Appreciate you. So if you have any questions right now, leave them in the comment section. I will be I can answer those questions for you should you have any questions. Or if you're watching a replay, make sure you leave those comments and questions in the description area of this broadcast, and I will definitely check back and watch those. I'll respond to those questions that you might have. All right, guys, I'm going to say ciao for now. If there are no questions, appreciate you. Thank you for joining in. We'll talk to you soon. Ciao for now. Bye-bye.